And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Starting off with tonight's weather, or actually the sea ice analysis here. We've got not much change from what we've seen the last couple of days here. Still a lot around St. Lawrence Island with the heaviest ice on the north side there. And then down here toward the north shore of Nunivak Island, in toward Kuskokwim Bay there. And a little bit of an increase here over Bristol Bay as well as Cook Inlet. And for the forecast for tonight, strong low pressure pulls northwestward there toward the northwestern Bering Sea. And the front, as a consequence of that northwestward movement, stays off the coast here and really weakens down over the Alaska Peninsula with a high wind warning ending by 6 p.m. Winds becoming definitely noticeably lighter throughout the night tonight. A lot of showers, gusty winds for the Aleutians, clear and cold in the interior again, and dry for the southeast coast. And the outlook for tomorrow, a few showers might develop in Dixon Entrance there, hopefully staying south of the Panhandle. Otherwise dry and cold over the interior. Increasing chances for rain here over Kodiak Island. And that front stationary off the coast there, right over the Alaska Peninsula. Light winds for tomorrow by comparison to what you had today there, with some periods of light rain and maybe some light snow for the right along the Yukon Delta coast. Mixed precipitation possible over the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Snow, a little bit of blowing snow, St. Lawrence Island to the Bering Strait. And then on Tuesday, really not much of a change in the pattern here, just another low coming onto the map there, pulling northwestward toward the Alaska Peninsula. Rain and wind Kodiak Island, westward toward the eastern Aleutians, may stay to the west of the moisture. And again, some light snow possibilities for Nunivak Island to St. Lawrence Island, but the wind's a lot lighter, especially over the northern Bering Sea now. And clear and cold in the interior. High wind watch out for the Juneau-Douglas area for northeast winds gusting to 60 miles per hour. And another low brings some wind and rain into the western and central Aleutians. And for the coastal water forecast here for the south coast, east winds tomorrow 15 to 20 knots. Winds out of the east on the north coast at 20 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, north winds 25 knots, north at about 20 for Stevens Passage. Winds east at 15 for Clarence Strait. Then increase in the winds here over all areas for tomorrow. Gale warnings here on the south coast, east 30 to 35 knots. Central and north coast, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for Lynn Canal, north winds 35 knots. Stevens Passage about the same. North 30 gusting 50 knots. And Clarence Strait, east winds at 20 knots. Prince William Sound tomorrow, east winds at about 10 knots. And small craft advisories for Cook Inlet for northeasterlies 20 to 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay. East winds 35 knots, seas 10 feet. East winds at 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast, and east at 20 for the east side. For the day on Tuesday, Prince William Sound, northeast wind at 15. Small craft advisories for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast at 25. Gale warnings for 35 knot winds there south of Resurrection Bay. Good gales here for the Barren Islands, east at 45 knots, seas 18 feet. Northeast at 40 knots for the Kamishak Bay area. Gale warning, southern Cook Inlet, northeast winds 35 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, gale warnings, east winds 35 to 40 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, east winds at 35 knots. And east winds 15 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And for the day on Tuesday, north to northeast winds at 20 to 30 knots for the peninsula. Still looking at gale force winds for Bristol Bay out of the east at 35 knots. Storm warnings in Shelikof Strait for northeast winds at 50 knots. Otherwise, east-northeast winds at 40 to 45 knots for the remainder of the Kodiak Island waters. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south to southwest winds at 15 to 20 knots. West-southwest for Adak and Atka at 20 to 25 knots. And west to southwest winds at 30 knots for the western Aleutians. And for Tuesday, for the western Aleutians there, winds swing around to mostly the east at 25 to 30 knots, and northeast at 20 to 25 knots for Adak and Atka, and the eastern Aleutians, northeast and northwest winds 15 to 30 knots. For the southwest coast and St. Lawrence Island, east winds at 30 knots tomorrow. And for Norton Sound, east winds at 35 knots. Southeast at 25 for the Pribilof Islands, and full gales here for St. Matthew Island. Southeast winds 45 knots, seas 24 feet. And then for the day on Tuesday, Pribilofs, north winds at 20, seas just under 10 feet. South winds at 30 knots with 10-foot seas for St. Matthew Island. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, east winds 25 knots, northeast at 30 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Eastern Boulevard Sea coast, or actually central and east side tomorrow, east winds 15 knots, big increase. Brisk wind advisories here for the western Arctic coast, east-northeast at 30 knots, and east-northeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea. Then on Tuesday, those winds lighten up. East-northeast, 15 to 20 knots for the Chukchi Sea. Brisk wind advisories hold, though, for the western Arctic coast, east at 30 knots, and east-northeast winds 20 knots for the central and east side.